So you guys remind me that I'm recording and like tell me to stop when we're done. Okay. Just, because yes. So what we're doing, for those of you that are watching the recording, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the first three questions in the optional genetics problems that are in this week's module. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and like work our way through them. Okay. And so the way I want to do this, how do I want to do this? I want to do this in a Word document because I don't like the whiteboard thing. Okay, so let me get myself organized here, and let's make this a little bigger so that y'all can see view. Where's view? Why can't I see view? There it is. View. Okay, let's zoom. Let's zoom 150. Let's see if that gets us where we want to be. Okay, can y'all see that? Can we see the words decently?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're just going to make a little space and we're going to go for it. Okay. So my number one hot tip always with genetics problems is write down what you know as you know it. Okay. Because that's going to really help you keep track of your thoughts. Okay. Essentially, genetics problems are very much like puzzle solving, right? So if you're somebody who likes solving puzzles or you like mysteries or things like that, you'll love this, right? Once you get the hang of it. If you're somebody that's just like, that's not fun for me, this might not be your favorite, but there it is. Okay. So good critical thinking practice is what we're doing here. So can you tell the genotype of a person with polydactyly, a disorder where individuals have extra fingers and toes, which is inherited in a dominant fashion? If you know nothing about their parents, explain. Okay, so I think the first thing we need to do, the very first thing we need to do, is we need to think about what these words mean. So what does the word genotype mean? So the two words that I'm thinking of are genotype and phenotype. And they kind of mean two different things, even though they sound really similar.
If I had to guess, I'd say it's the type of genes you have.
So alleles, but yes, right? So genotype means the alleles that somebody has.
Okay.
And so what's an allele? What's the difference between the word allele and gene? That's kind of tricky.
Well, isn't an allele like a variation of genes?
Right, exactly. Perfect. So the examples, that we talk about the most in the videos are, we do like pea flower color a lot, and then we talk about like dog fur.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's others too. And sorry about the barking if you guys can hear that. That's probably Luna. Anyway, shut up out there. She listened to me. Anyway, so different versions of a gene. So for example, in pea flowers, there is a gene that is responsible for the color of the pea flowers. There are different versions of that gene, and those different versions are called alleles. So there's one version of the gene that makes the flowers purple, and there's another version that makes the flowers white. Okay, so alleles are different versions of a particular gene. Okay, so genotype means which alleles do you have? Well, one of the things that Mendel figured out pretty quickly actually was that everybody has, for any gene, right, you've got two alleles for that gene because you inherited one from mom and one from dad. Okay, even if you're a pea plant, right, you inherit one from your parent, from your male parent, and one from your female parent if you are a sexually reproducing organism, which we are, and peas are, okay, and dogs are, and all of the other examples we're going to use. Okay, so genotype is what alleles does an individual have. Okay, so we know what that is. So polydactyly means having extra fingers or toes. Okay, that's not something you need to memorize. It's just an example that's kind of convenient because it's interesting and it's inherited in a very straightforward fashion. And the way that it is inherited is in a dominant fashion. So what does that mean? What do the terms dominant and recessive mean? So that's a pair of terms again.
Usually dominant genes like mask over recessive genes if a parent does have recessive genes.
Perfect.
So
That's
the parent with the dominant genes, like the genes will go towards the child, it'll most likely mask the recessive. Yeah.
yeah, that's perfect, right? So dominant essentially covers up, or like you said, it masks, right, the recessive gene. One of the things that I say like 14 times in the video, so sorry, you're going to hear that a lot if you haven't listened to them all yet, is that dominant isn't necessarily better or more common, or there's no like value judgment on it. It just means that it covers it up, or it masks it. Okay, so perfect. So what this means, if we say that polydactyly is a dominant disorder, what that means is that if an individual has a polydactyly allele, right, it will be expressed because it will mask or cover up the quote normal allele, which is the standard, 5 fingers, 5 toes situation. Okay. So another thing I always like to do is I like to come up with symbols, because that helps me kind of think of, keep track of my thoughts. Okay. So maybe let's use F for fingers. And the reason I'm picking F instead of P for polydactyly is that it's a little bit easier, at least in my handwriting, to tell the difference between an uppercase and a lowercase f than it is a P, especially when I'm using the little pen and writing on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to pick, for my 2 alleles, I'm going to pick capital F and lowercase f. Now, the 2 different alleles we're talking about are polydactyly, the having of extra fingers and toes, and normal, having 5 fingers and toes on each. So which allele am I going to symbolize with the capital F, the big F?
The polydactyly?
Why? Yes, and why?
Because it's the dominant trait.
Perfect. Polydactyl. Okay. And then the little f would therefore be
The normal. Yeah.
Okay. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. So now we don't need to do a Punnett square or anything to answer this question, right? This isn't one of those kinds of questions. There are those coming up, but this doesn't do that. This just is asking you, okay, so if you see a person, right? So I'm going to tell a story because it's a funny story, and it's easy to remember things when you tell a story. My friend and I and our husbands were at a baseball game, and my friend and I both teach biology, and our husbands don't. They teach other things. And so we're sitting there at this baseball game, and baseball, good times, right? And we look over and there's a family next to us, and the little girl that's sitting in somebody's lap has extra fingers and toes. And I'm like, yo, Emily, polydactyly over there. And so we get all nerded out about it, right? And we're like, okay, let's make this like a genetics problem in our head, right? So in our head, we're thinking, what is the genotype? So her phenotype, what does phenotype mean, by the way?
So a physical trait that you can see.
Right, that you can see or that is expressed, because some things you can't see visually, right? But it's whatever trait is being expressed.
Yeah.
So with this particular little girl, I could see an extra finger and toe. So I knew, at least, I'm trying not to be too obnoxious with the staring. It's like, anyway. Okay. So I can see she's got the polydactyl phenotype. So then it was like, I wonder what her genotype is. Okay. So since I could see an extra finger, I knew she had one big F. Was it possible to tell by looking at her what her second, the reason I put a little blank there, is it possible to tell by looking at her if she has 2 big Fs or if she has a big F and a little f. Possible to tell by looking at her.
Would it be by looking at her other hand? Or
Well, I mean, it wouldn't matter because she's polydactyl one way or the other. So it wouldn't matter how, it could just be on one hand, could be on both of her hands and both of her feet.
Or
Either
would
way,
it
it
be
would
like,
still.
would you have to look at her parents, like to see if she has two big Fs?
Okay, so, that's a good question, right? So, first of all, when you have a dominant allele,
Mhm.
it covers up the recessive. So just
Mhm.
visually speaking, no, we could
Okay.
not tell. Okay, so
Mhm.
no, we can't tell if this person is heterozygous. What does that mean, heterozygous?
Big F, little f, like two different letters.
So
Yeah.
hetero meaning different, right? So heterozygous meaning having two different alleles. Okay,
Or
I'm gonna make
homo
myself more space.
with two
Or
Fs, big Fs.
homozygous. In this case, we would say homozygous dominant
Mm-hmm.
because we know it's a dominant trait. So
Okay.
no, we can't tell. And the reason that we can't tell, assuming we don't know anything about her parents,
Yeah.
the reason we can't tell is because there's no way of knowing, right? Just
Mhm.
by looking at somebody. Because if somebody was this, they would look exactly the same, right? Is that. So
Yeah.
the reason we can't tell that is because those two genotypes have the exact same phenotype.
Okay. They look the same.
Right. Exactly. Okay, they
Okay.
look the same. Okay, I'm using the fancy words because that's what we're supposed to be doing. But yes. Okay, so they have the same phenotype. So then let's get back to my example of the girl. So what do you think my friend and I then were very motivated to do after we both acknowledged that the little girl had extra fingers and toes? What were we then doing?
Ask the parents if they had any polydactyl in their
No,
families.
we had a little too much tact to ask them, but instead we were like looking like, right, we're like, do the parents have fingers? How many toes does mom have? How many toes does dad have? How many fingers?
Yeah.
Right? So we're on the like subtle low key like lookout to try to figure it out. Okay. And the funniest part of this whole story is that I don't remember like what we ultimately figured out. I'm pretty sure that we noticed an extra toe on one of the parents. One of the tricky things about polydactyly too is that because hands and feet are so like visible and people get freaked out about stuff, they often will do surgery to remove the extra bits just because people are, for cosmetic reasons. There's nothing harmful about having extra fingers or toes, but it weirds people out or it makes it hard to find shoes that fit. So it's entirely possible that the parents, had surgery to remove any extra nubbins, but it was exciting because we were and we were doing like, real life genetics. So fundamentally, we could not come away with any kind of a conclusion about that little girl. Okay, now let's scroll down to the next one. Okay, so another easily observable trait is skin pigmentation, right? So if if you see somebody with albinism, there's one thing that makes it complicated is it's a little bit tricky in the sense that there's different kinds of albinism. But if we're just talking about like full on no pigment in your hair, no pigment in your skin, no pigment in your eyes, that kind of albinism, what that's going to mean is that your hair is going to be white. Your skin is going to be so white that it's pink practically, right? Because you have no pigment in your skin. So you can actually see the blood, right, underneath the skin. So somebody looks kind of pink when they're like full on albino, it's like pale white to kind of a pinky color. And then if you've ever seen like an albino rabbit, sometimes even they have pink eyes, right? Because you can see the blood vessels in their eyes because they have no pigment. Okay.
Yeah.
So if at the baseball game we did not see somebody with albinism, but let's just imagine question that we did because that makes it more fun. Okay, so let's say then on the other side of us, a family sits down and there's somebody there that doesn't have any pigment. Okay,
Mhm.
since I'm telling you here that it is inherited in a recessive fashion, can I tell their genotype just by looking at them? So what does it mean if something's inherited in a recessive way? What does it mean if a trait is recessive?
Mm. Like it's not as common, or
Oh, so this is the tricky thing, right? Is that remember that dominant and recessive don't necessarily mean how common something
okay,
is or
yeah.
not, right? So often that's true. Often recessive traits are not as common, okay? But not
Because isn't it
always.
harder for a recessive gene to come through, especially if there is a dominant gene? Like,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Okay. Because remember that if the dominant allele is present, it covers it up. Yes.
yeah.
Okay. So in this particular case, right? Let's make some symbols and work our way through it. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm going to use A for albinism, but this is sort of problematic because usually we try to use a letter that refers to the dominant
Mhm.
trait for our
Not
capital
recessive.
letter, right? Not
Yeah.
recessive. In this case, though, I mean, I guess you know what? Let's do it this way. Let's use N for normal pigmentation.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to use N, big N, little n for normal pigmentation. So it says that albinism is recessive in the question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so those are our symbols, right? Because albinism is a recessive trait, right? We give it the lowercase letter. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just, pretend that another family is sitting on the other side of us. And in that family, one of the kids is ghostly pale, white hair, pinkish eyes, right? And we go, whoa, this is the best genetics filled baseball game ever. Right? And so we look over at this kid. Can we tell the genotype of that kid? Obviously, their phenotype, right? It's clear to us that they have no pigment. So that's their phenotype. But can we determine their genotype? Just by looking at them.
I don't think so. Like, how would you be able to?
Okay, so little n is albinism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And remember that when we're talking about these, dominant and recessive disorders, right? Not even just that, when we're talking about genetics in general, right? Everybody has two alleles. Okay. So, okay. Actually, I'm going to do it this way. Okay. So we know if they're albino, they've got a little n. If their genotype, just thought experiment, right? If their genotype was big N, little n, heterozygous, would they be albino? Would they have that phenotype?
No, because there's one dominant N, which would cover up the recessive
Right. So
albinism
the
trait.
normal allele, right, which happens to be dominant in this case, would cover up the recessive allele. So that can't be, it's not possible for that to be their genotype, right? And of course, it's also obviously not possible that it's two big N's because that's both normal pigment. So that's definitely not going to be, right? So
Wouldn't it be
only way,
two little N's?
I was going to say
the only way that somebody will express a recessive phenotype is if their genotype is homozygous recessive. Okay, so scroll down a little bit. The only way a recessive phenotype will be expressed is when homozygous. Sorry, this is messy. Recessive. Right? Because any dominant allele is going to cover that up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so then you wouldn't see that phenotype. Now, here's the interest. So then, right, if you're, if this like makes you, if you enjoy this stuff and you like thinking about, the possibilities, then you could think about, well, I'm going to look at the rest of the family and what's going on with the rest of the family. And what do I know about their genotypes or phenotypes, or, you know what I mean? Like you could go in the weeds big time about thinking about that. Okay. All right. Let's, do I hear a puppy?
I'm sorry. She's mad at
Well,
me for
that's
ignoring
okay.
her.
I'm like, that's a dog yawn. Either that or Chewbacca's at your house, one or the other. One of the two. Do you have huskies, Madison? Is that right?
I do. She's mad at me right now. She's talking.
You can tell. They make a very specific vocalization when they're like,
They do.
I'm not happy with what's happening right now.
Stop doing homework and pay attention to me.
Yeah, pay attention to me. Why aren't you paying attention to me?
Yeah.
Okay, so now question 3 is going back to polydactyly. So we've already done some of our work up here, right? We've already figured out what our symbols are going to be and all of that. So now question number 3 is, okay, we've got 2 people that are heterozygous for polydactyly, and I'm reminding you it's a dominant disorder. So let's see if I can do this neatly. So normal fingers, polydactyl. Okay. So now the question is, okay, so I'm putting that there to remind me, because I like to do that whenever I do genetics problems, is, write out my work so I can keep track. It says 2 people that are heterozygous. So heterozygous means what? What does it mean?
2 different, so a big F and a little f. So
Right,
2 of those.
Two different alleles. Good. So I'm crossing one person that is heterozygous with another person that is heterozygous. Okay. They get married, they have babies. Okay. Or I want to know, what are the chances that they will have a child with a normal number of fingers and toes?
So don't we do a Punnett square for this one?
We would. Okay. Oh man. All right. I need to give a little more space. Okay. Punnett square. Okay. So here's the big question. How do we set up a Punnett square?
Put big F, little f on top, big F, little f on the side.
Okay, that's true. That is correct. But I want to know why we do it that way. What is it that represents?
So the one on top will represent like the male, and then the one on the side will represent the female. So yeah.
Yes, that is also true. And I have a follow-up question. Okay, why is it that we put a big F and a little f?
Because they're heterozygous.
Yes. I'm trying to figure out how to ask you what I'm trying to get you to tell me without giving you a hint, and I'm failing.
I'm sorry.
So no, it's fine. It's not on you. It's on me, because I'm not tricky enough to figure out how to like get you there without, Okay. So remember that each of these parents, so let's say this is dad and this is, the potential mom, right? Yeah. Each parent has 2 alleles, but when they make their gametes, which is the generic name for eggs and sperm, when they produce gametes, do gametes have 2 alleles in them?
No.
Okay. No, they don't, right? They only have 1 of each. And we haven't yet learned the mechanism of meiosis yet. So we haven't learned why that's true yet. We just know, because Mendel figured it out, right? That whole law of segregation is what he called it. Mendel figured out that if an adult has 2 alleles, the eggs or sperm that they produce, depending on, what they're making, right, have only 1 allele. So what the Punnett square represents is essentially what we're saying in this Punnett square is we're saying that dad can make sperm that have either a big F or a little f. So those are essentially like our 2 options for the sperm. Okay. And then mom, because she also happens to be heterozygous,
Those are
right?
the only eggs she can produce.
She can make an egg with a big F or an
Mhm.
egg with a little f, right? So those are all the different combinations that she could make.
Okay.
We good so far?
Yeah.
Okay. And then the mechanics of filling in the Punnett square, what does that look like?
So the first box will have big F, because you pair the two on top, or the one on
So-
top and the one on the side.
Right. So essentially what you do is you drag from the top down
Yeah.
and from the side over, right? So I'm just going to do drag down first.
Yeah.
So I took the two from the top and pulled them down, and then I'm going to take the two from the side and bring them over. So F, F, little f, little f. All right. So there's our Punnett square. So we showed our work with a Punnett square, but we still haven't answered the question. So the question is, what are the chances they will have a child with normal fingers and toes? So I want to know probability of normal. I'm just going to say normal. I'm not going to write fingers and toes. So what is the probability of that happening? Well,
A 1
to
in
figure
4
that out,
chance.
we have to know what these different
Yeah.
boxes mean.
Well, the
Right?
2 little F's would be normal. And that's the only
Yes.
box
Okay.
with 1. So 1 out of 4, 25% chance.
Exactly. Does everybody else get that? So maybe let's go slower, right?
Okay.
That's absolutely correct, but let's just, go through it slow.
Yeah.
All of the rest of these
Have a big F dominant.
have at least one, if not two, big Fs.
Yeah.
And because polydactyl is dominant, that means all of these are going to have a polydactyl phenotype. Yeah?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to write pheno. I meant to write poly. Okay, so Madison's absolutely right. The probability of normal is 1/4 or 25% chance. Right? So the thing about polydactyl is because it is a dominant disorder, it runs in families pretty strong because it's dominant. It covers up the normal trait. So it's found basically in every generation, right? Almost all the time. It can, somebody can end up with it. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's very frequent. It shows up frequently. Okay. Not all the time, but very frequently. Okay. All right. Do we want to do another one? How are we doing? Tell me what you want.
Well, that makes sense to me, but I don't know about everybody else.
Would it be helpful everybody else to do another one?
Yes, I'm lost.
Okay. That's fair.
I'm not
Totally
completely
fair.
lost, but it's making sense.
It's like, oh, the thoughts are starting to congeal. They're not fully there yet, but yes, I totally understand that feeling.
Same here. So
Same Safa? Okay, perfect. Right. And this is why I was telling you guys, I'm like, genetics is rough, man, because the first lecture, right, which is this stuff, you really have to work your way through that to get that to stick and make sense before you can go on. So we can do as many of these things as you want, right, to make sure we're there. Okay, so all right, so a man who is a known carrier for Tay-Sachs disease. So we got a new disease that we're talking about. Marries a woman with no family history of the disease. He has seen family members lose their children because it's a devastating disease and he doesn't want to have a kid that has that condition. So as his genetic counselor, we're assuming that we do not have genetic tests that can answer the questions for us, right? So we're going to figure out what are his chances of having an affected child. Okay, so we have a lot of things that we have to unpack here. Okay, and so the first one is Tay-Sachs disease is a recessive disorder. So once again, I'm just going to use T standing for Tay-Sachs, but since it's a recessive disorder, we have to use the little t to represent that disorder. And the big T is normal. Now, fundamentally, when you're doing genetics problems, you can use whatever letters you want, right? It's sort of traditional to use letters a certain way, But fundamentally, you could just use A for everything, right? If you wanted to. So that part doesn't really matter. But do you understand why Tay-Sachs gets a little t and normal is getting a big T? Are we both okay on that? Are we
Yeah.
both? Are we all okay on that? Yes, I'm seeing nodding. Okay. Right. So I know that because it says that the disorder is recessive. Okay. Now, he is a known carrier. So this is actually terminology that I think I don't introduce until the second or third video, I think. But when you see the word carrier, what you should automatically, the way your brain should go, right, is when you hear the term carrier, you should immediately think heterozygous, because carrier typically means that somebody carries a disorder allele, but they're not expressing the disorder, right? So if he was expressing the disorder, we would say a man who has Tay-Sachs disease, right? Or someone who is suffering from Tay-Sachs disease, or something to that effect would mean that he has the disease, he has the symptoms, he has it. If we say that somebody is a carrier, that means they don't have that phenotype, right? He doesn't have the Tay-Sachs phenotype. But because of his family history, presumably, we know that he's a carrier for it, okay? So if carrier means heterozygous, then what is our man's genotype going to be?
Big T, little t.
Perfect, because he's a carrier. Okay. All right. He marries a woman. And it says about the woman with no family history of the disease. So if she has no family history of it, it's not in her family at all, what are we going to assume about her genotype?
She has 2 big T's.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Because if
It's
nobody
not-
in her family has it, it's incredibly unlikely that she's a carrier, right? So we're assuming that she's homozygous for the normal situation. Okay. Beautiful, lovely, fantastic. Okay, now we get to his question, right? So it's devastating, it's awful. People who have Tay-Sachs die in childhood. It's really, and it's not pretty. It's like this awful, like, wasting away. It's really sad and heartbreaking. Okay. So he's like, I don't want to have, biological children if that's going to be the case. So he's asking a genetic counselor, what do I do? What are my chances of having a child with this woman that are going to have this terrible, terrible disease? Okay, so we're going to do a Punnett square to find out. Okay, tell me what to put on the sides of the Punnett square.
Do we do like the same thing we did in the last one, like the T, big T, little t, and then on the top, and then on the bottom,
Keep
big
going.
T, little t?
Okay, well, remember that we make it specifically for these two parents.
The man and woman. Okay, so maybe we should just do like how it is right now. So big T, and then on top is big T, little t.
Okay, and so remember, and I'm gonna be like a broken record. I'm gonna keep saying this. Remember that what we're doing, right, is we're thinking about, okay, this man, because he has a big T and a little t, he can make sperm. On average, half of his sperm are going to have a big T. The other half of his sperm are going to have a little t.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what can we say about the woman and her eggs?
Because it's not like from her family history, so it's normal.
So her eggs are only going to have
2.
Capital T.
Remember, eggs only have 1. They don't have 2 letters. So her eggs can only have a big T. So what you can do, and this is a lot of times people do this just because if you're used to a Punnett square that has 4 squares in it, right? We don't technically, this whole row, we don't need. Because remember, the only kind of allele that she has for this gene is the big T. She doesn't have little t's, right? So we don't need to repeat the big T twice. We can, right? So we will in this, example, but I'll show you why it doesn't matter. Okay, so, and then we do the filling down and the filling across. Yes?
Yeah.
That part's comfortable?
Mhm.
Yes? Okay. So let's fill down first and then across. And it doesn't really matter what order you do it in. I just, that's how I do it. And then across, T, 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 T. Okay. So then you will notice, as I mentioned, that the top row and the bottom row are identical, right?
Yeah,
Because
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So that's why you're saying we don't need. Okay.
Exactly. Now, like I said, though, if it makes you more comfortable, if you're like Punnett squares are supposed to have 4 squares, I need my Punnett square to have 4 squares, right? If that's something that you need, because otherwise you're like,
Lost. Yeah.
nervous, that's fine. But then and that's fine because it's not hurting anything, right? But essentially it just shows you, right, a replicate, which is fine. Okay. So now the question is this. So I'm gonna scribble this out because for me, it's easier for me personally if I'm looking at fewer squares because then I'm able to like do the fractions easier. So for me, it's better for me to look at this because I'm like, okay, half of the kids are this, half of the kids are this, rather than 2/4 of the kids are this and 2/4 of the kids are that. Right. So that's what I like to do. But fundamentally, whatever works better for your own brain is fine. Ultimately, you're going to get the same result. Okay. So here's my question for you. What is the phenotype of an individual with 2 big T's?
Normal.
Normal, right? So this is normal phenotype. Okay. What about this? What is their phenotype? Is it normal or is it Tay-Sachs disease?
Tay-Sachs disease.
Is it?
It doesn't
Well,
do both, I think.
Actually, no. It might be normal too.
Would be the same as the dad, normal being a known carrier.
Yeah.
Perfect. Good job, you guys. Right? Exactly. So their phenotype is normal, right? They don't have the disease because the only way in a recessive disorder, the only way to have that disordered phenotype is to be homozygous recessive. Okay. So essentially what this Punnett square tells us is it tells us that between this particular man and this particular woman, they have 0 risk of having any children who actually have the disorder, right? It is impossible based on their genetic combinations between the two of them. It's impossible for them to have a child with this disorder. However, on average, there's a 50% chance that any of their children could be carriers, right?
So if it was like it came out to 2 little t's, it would become Tay-Sachs.
Yes, they would express the
50
Tay-Sachs disorder,
50%.
right? They would
Okay,
express the symptoms of that disease. Okay.
Yeah,
So perhaps as the genetic counselor, you would say to him, good news, right? You picked a lady that since she has no family history, right? The two of you will not have any kids that have Tay-Sachs. However, you do want to make sure that your kids know that there is a 50-50 chance that they are carriers.
Yeah.
So that when they grow up and choose, if they choose to have kids themselves, right? That they're aware that there's a 50-50 chance that they could be a carrier so that they can get their own genetic testing, right? To make sure, you know, that they're in the clear. Is that okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Let me just scroll through some of these other problems. Okay. So this next one, number 5, is about blood type. And so blood type is something that we do in one of the later videos. So I would feel better about doing that with you all when I know you guys have gotten to that point. So I would be happy to do these with you now, but I'm thinking that it might be better to wait until like tomorrow or Friday, if you're willing, or even next week, because remember that genetics we're kind of spreading over 2 weeks. So we've got some time to like absorb and all of that. Okay. So number 5 and number 6 are both about blood type, right? Which is a codominance situation. So, right. So codominance. And if you're like, I don't know what codominance is yet, that's okay. You'll get there. Okay. And then 7 and 8 are both about incomplete dominance. So once again, I don't want to, if you're like, I don't know what incomplete dominance is yet, I don't want to try to work through these, okay, until you're there. So maybe those we can wait a little bit too. Oh gosh, then 9 is about sex linkage. So once again, not ready for this. Not ready. Okay. Oh man. Oh, 10 we can do if you want. Do we want to do 10? Or are you guys like, that's enough for today? I need a break. I need to like sit and think. And also maybe you want to work through some of these on your own and then check in with me. So you guys tell me what works for you.
Good.
Do we want to do 10 or do we want to just like stop for a bit?
I say we get stopped, but if
I would
I'm
stop.
willing to sit through another one.
Or you guys, if you want, I could let you guys try to work through something and then come back to me if you want to do that. It's up to you. Okay, I'm going to stop recording first of all. Okay, so I'm stopping. Stop. Wait. Did I stop recording earlier? No, I didn't. I'm such a mess. Stop recording.